Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the American Library in Paris. Hi, I'm Rachel Donadio. I'm the curator of cultural programs here. Tonight, we're continuing the library's Ways of Seeing programming series, and in this special event exploring the art, literature, and an iconic friendship that defined a Gilded Age, we are joined this evening by Jean Strouse and Madeleine Schwartz to discuss the friendship between Singer Sargent and Henry James. These artists both spent formative years in Paris, then settled in London, where they were neighbors and good friends, one working in paint, the other in prose. They vividly captured an era of dramatic social change, with the old aristocracy in steep decline as fresh energies and new wealth emerged. Sound familiar? How did their friendship influence each other's work, and what can that previous Gilded Age tell us about the time we're currently living in? Madeleine and Jean will be in conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions from you in the audience. I will now introduce our speakers. Jean Strouse is the author of Morgan, an American Financier, and Alice James, a Biography, which won the Bancroft Prize in American History. Her essays and reviews have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Review of Books, The New York Times, and elsewhere. She has been a fellow of the MacArthur Foundation and served as director of the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library from 2003 to 2017. Her new book, Family Romance, Singer Sargent and the Wertheimers, was published in 2024. Can we have a big round of applause for Jean? And joining us in the conversation this evening is Madeleine Schwartz, who is editor-in-chief of The Dial, the award-winning magazine of international writing. Madeleine lives in Paris, where she writes about the rise of the far right, urban politics, and art fraud. Her work appears in the London Review of Books, The New Yorker, and the New York Review of Books, where she previously worked as an editor. She teaches journalism at Sciences Po. Welcome, Madeleine. And Emma is going to help with the slides. We have images tonight.
Well, here we go. Well, welcome, everyone. It's so nice to be here. I don't think I've been at the library with this very impressive stage, but it's very suitable for our conversation tonight about two great artists working in different media who had a friendship that both informed their work and the world that they lived in, which we'll get into tonight. So, Jean, to start out, both Singer Sargent and Henry James spent a great deal of time in Europe, which was actually, unlike perhaps today, unusual for Americans at their time. Let's start with that.
Okay, thank you. And thank you all for coming. This is really fun. So Henry James's father, Henry James Sr., thank you. Now can you all hear me? He hauled his young family back. There were 5 kids. He hauled them back and forth, across the Atlantic, the way people now go from Boston to New York. He wanted to give his 4 boys what he called a sensuous education, by which he meant exposure to foreign cultures, languages, music, art. And then each time he would find the experiment disappointing and take them all back to America. As a result, the children never stayed in one place long enough to really form friendships with other kids. And Henry Jr. later described them as having been hotel children. When the adult William started having children of his own, their sister Alice begged him not to repeat the mistake their father had made, producing their rootless and accidental childhood. The sensuous education that the father had in mind proved really the most valuable for Henry the novelist, who traveled frequently to Europe on his own as soon as he was old enough to go by himself. He tried living in Paris for some years and then settled permanently in England in his 30s in 1876. Sargent, his parents were lived in Philadelphia. They had a baby who died, and they went to Europe to cheer up Mrs. Sargent and never came back. So John was born in Florence in 1856. His grandmother, his mother's mother, was traveling with them. She called him Fra Giovanni. They traveled constantly. There were 2 more children, daughters. They were not extremely wealthy, but obviously comfortable enough. The father was a doctor, but he wasn't working the whole time they were in Europe. He wanted to go back a lot to his family and his medical practice, but Mrs. Sargent wanted to stay abroad, and she won. So they would go to the mountains, to Switzerland in the hot months, and to the south in the cold months, making good sense. John was a very talented musician as well as an extraordinarily gifted artist. He spoke French fluently, and Italian and German and some Spanish. He didn't set foot in the United States until he was 20, but always considered himself American, which we'll get to a little bit later.
And as we talked about when we were preparing, the whole Sargent family actually moved to Paris in 1874 so that John could study here. Paris was at that time very much the capital of the art world. What kind of Paris did he find, and what were his experiences here?
Let me just go back for 1 second and ask for the other slide that we have first, because I forgot about that. That's young Sargent when he was in Paris, actually, in his studio. And here is a Sargent drawing of Henry James from 1886. So we'll get to their friendship again in a minute, but I didn't want to forget about that. Sargent had great early success in Paris. It was, I don't know if I can give an adequate description of what Paris was like then. He enrolled at the École des Beaux-Arts and also studied with a well-known portrait painter of the time named Carolus Duran, who urged all of his students to study Velázquez, which Sargent absolutely did. He went to Madrid and copied a number of the most famous paintings, including Las Meninas, which shows up in his own work. Also Frans Hals, Manet in Paris. I don't think they ever met, but he certainly saw everything Manet did during Sargent's lifetime. And Ingres, those were his great admirations. He began showing work at the Paris Salon in 1877, just 3 years after he'd arrived, and every year after that for a decade. So it was an extraordinary debut, really. He did some of his most original work during those Paris years. Could we see the next slide, please? This is a staircase in Capri. He loved to travel and painted. He worked all the time, all his life. He painted wherever he was. So this, just you could call this anything, like varieties of white. It's not easy to do that, obviously, and it's one of my favorite paintings. And it's in the current show at the Musée d'Orsay. And the next one, please. Also varieties of white. It's called Fumée d'Ambre, and it's a Moroccan woman. I'm pretty sure she's a model because she's wearing makeup and no veil. And she was just posed in the courtyard of a Moroccan house, and he loved those grays, the whites, the beiges. It's just, if you set him free, that's what he wanted to do. And then the next one is one of his absolutely greatest paintings, I think, and that also is in Paris right now. It's The Daughters of Edward Darley Boyd. Boyd was also an artist and a friend of Sargent from Boston. His wife was a Cushing. They had these 4 girls, and they commissioned him to do portraits of them. This is not like any portrait of children you will ever see anywhere again. And it's very influenced by Las Meninas. The tall Chinese, it was done in the sort of entryway to their hotel, to their apartment in Paris. And they're so disconnected from each other that they are not looking at each other. The ones in the back one of them is practically invisible. You just see her in shade. And the little one is the most directly sort of engaged with us with her doll, but who knows what is going on within them and among them. But it's just a very, very powerful painting. When in the years I was working on this book before it came out, people heard I was working about a family Sargent had painted, and they all thought it was this one. And there is a very good book about this one called Sargent's Daughters by Erica Hirschler, who's a leading Sargent expert at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. I recommend it. And I saw this show in New York. I haven't yet seen it in Paris. I'm going tomorrow. But in some ways, this painting is the star of the show. Partly the way they hung it, the color they have behind it, it just stands out. And he was barely 20 years old. So then, could we have the next slide, please? Then he gets in trouble, as you probably know. So this Madame X, as it's called, her name was Virginie Gautreau. She was an American from Louisiana, and she married a French banker. And she was very much, very socially ambitious on the way up in Parisian society. She was also, some people said, quite a sexual adventurer. I don't know about that for sure. But he was transfixed by the way she looked and asked to paint her portrait. It was not a commission. He just thought she was fascinating looking and I think they both thought that a painting of her was going to establish both of them in some new way that they hadn't achieved before. She powdered her skin a sort of lavender green, and she, as you can see, she rouged one ear. So her ear is red, the rest of her sort of pale green. He worked on it for a long time and had a very hard time with it. At one point he complained to a friend of her extreme laziness and unpaintable beauty. And he was more anxious about this than about most of his paintings. Usually he painted, he finished it, he sent it to the salon, and there was no fuss. This he was uncharacteristically worried about. He asked Oscar Wilde to come to Paris to his studio to look at it. I don't know what difference that would have made, but that it indicated his anxiousness. So, as you probably know, and we can talk about this maybe more in the questions, I don't want to spend all our time on Madame X, but Paris was horrified. Quelle horreur. It was really a scandal, and it's kind of hard now to understand why. I mean, the right strap was off her shoulder, so it was even more suggestive than it is. Critics actually liked it a lot, but the Parisian society was just undone. And the day after the opening at the Salon, the mother of Madame Gautreau and she came to Sargent's studio in tears and asked him to take it down. He said, "We can't do that. It's not done." And then they asked him to at least paint the strap upright on her shoulder. And he wouldn't do that either. He said the salon wouldn't allow any alterations. I don't know whether that's true or not. But so she, Madame Gautreau, had thought it was a masterpiece before the reaction in the salon. And she went into retreat for several months. Sargent eventually took it back to his studio when this show was over. And he did put the strap back up on his own, not for any reason of propriety. And he was... could we see the next slide? He kept it in his studio for years so that everyone who came to see him could see it. This is his studio was on the Boulevard Berthier, and and the strap is back up. There are some photographs in this exhibition of it down. It's not that shocking, and Manet had painted Olympia entirely nude many years before, but she was a prostitute, and Madame X was in society, and I think some of the shock was that they were both American and on the make in very different ways. I mean, Sargent legitimately with his great talent, and she socially. And I think Parisians did not take to that. But you all might know more than I do about that. So, shall we move on?
Yes, and of course, how did this affect his career and his relationship with Paris after this big, unimaginable scandal?
Yes. Well, it did. The commission sort of dried up after that. He had been getting work from all kinds of people in France, and it wasn't the end of his time in France. He did keep showing here for another 3 or 4 years. But I thought the break was more definitive than that, but it wasn't. But in 1882, he was introduced to Henry James here by a mutual friend named Henrietta Roybell, who stayed a very, very close friend of James's. She had a famous salon for artists and writers in Paris and was, as I said, very close to both men. They had similar sensibilities and perspectives. They were Americans abroad. They had close affiliations with European and British aristocrats, although neither was ever going to be one of us in aristocratic society. Both in their work were comparing Europe and America, chronicling these dramatic social changes that were going on, and especially portraying new, quote-unquote, women. James, I think I skipped over something. James and Whistler urged Sargent to move to London after the Madame X scandal, and he slowly did. He actually took over Whistler's studio in Chelsea and lived very nearby Henry James. They saw each other quite a lot after that. So.
And James wrote about Sargent. We saw the picture that Sargent made of James, but the portraits went both ways. What did James say?
He really proved enormously instrumental to Sargent, not only recommending that he come to England, but he introduced him to patrons on both sides of the Atlantic, particularly Isabella Stewart Gardner, who became a lifelong patron and friend. And he wrote a lavish appreciation, thank you, of Sargent's work in Harper's New Monthly magazine in 1887, saying, among other things, that the early paintings offered the, quote, slightly uncanny spectacle of a talent which, on the very threshold of its career, has nothing more to learn. James went on, as he intended to do, at considerable length. Having published his own brilliant novel, Portrait of a Lady, in 1881, he generously declared, "There is no greater work of art than a great portrait, a truth to be constantly taken to heart by a painter holding in his hands the weapon that Mr. Sargent wields." A literary critic friend of mine wrote an article called Henry James's Portrait Envy. So, yeah, he was very supportive.
And what did Sargent say about James publicly, if anything?
Not very much. In fact, one of the problems in writing about him was he didn't say very much about anything. He wrote charming letters, but they're not. He doesn't tell you much about himself. They're about what's going on, about his friends. Really not self-revealing, which we'll see in a portrait of him later on. But there are a couple of entertaining stories about what he thought about James. Sargent and Claude Monet had become good friends in Paris. And in 1901, Monet was in London working on a series of paintings of the Houses of Parliament. And Sargent took him to watch Queen Victoria's funeral procession from a private house belonging to Sargent's friends facing Buckingham Palace. Monet was enthralled by the spectacle, and he reported in French to his wife in great detail. One of the people he met was, quote, a great American writer living entirely in England, speaking French admirably, who was completely charming to me, explaining everything, pointing out all the important people of the court, etc. In parenthesis, his name is Henry James. Sargent says he's the greatest writer in English. And on another occasion, Sargent sighed to a friend that he longed for Henry James's ability to say something so obscure you only know what he meant the next day. If then.
And both men also had in common a sexuality that was sometimes obscure, or that they were somewhat obfuscating. How did they each of them deal with that at this particular time, and how does it come through in the work that they made?
It comes through in very different ways in each of their work. Thanks, I got it. I just want to. So could we have the next slide? I think, yeah. This is Sargent did a lot of paintings, more drawings than paintings of nude men. This is one of the least explicit, but there are some that are very much more so, including a full full frontal nude at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts of Thomas McKellar, which is wonderful. He was an elevator man in a hotel Sargent was staying at in Boston, black, and clearly so they became good friends, at least, we don't know. And he had McKellar model for a number of other things, but this one painting that's a portrait is just extraordinary. And James too, both men were almost certainly homosexual in inclination, but neither of them talked about it at all. And James, late in his life, had certainly a crush and possibly a sexual relationship with a Danish-American sculptor named Henrik Andersen, but we don't know. And Sargent, as far as anyone knows, never had a sexual relationship. Certainly, as I said, his interests were in men, but I don't know. And people who have known much more about Sargent than I have written. There's a wonderful book by Trevor Fairbrother called Sargent the Sensualist, which writes about a lot of this and shows a lot of these drawings were mostly not shown during Sargent's lifetime. And Trevor, who is himself gay, couldn't conclude of anything specific of an actual consummated relationship, but he writes very much about the sensibility and the social world Sargent inhabited. Both Sargent and James lived in very gay-centric worlds, but it was not, well, that's about all we know. So Sargent never married, and there's no evidence of his having sexual relationships with either women or men. Like James, he appears to have been, sorry, I'm repeating what I just said, he appears to have been primarily attracted to men, not that such inclinations would have been a bar to social acceptance in England. Yet homosexual acts defined as gross indecency under English law in 1885 were punishable by 2 years in prison with or without hard labor. When they led to public scandal, as they did for Oscar Wilde in 1895, the doors to many closets shut tight. So someone said, both of them, Sargent and James, drew indelible portraits of women in the years around the turn of the 20th century. A James acquaintance noted that the novelist, quote, seemed to look at women rather as women looked at them. Women look at women as persons. Men look at them as women. The quality of sex in women, which is their first and chief attraction to most men, was not their chief attraction to James. That was a friend of James's, nor was it to Sargent. So they certainly featured women very prominently in their written and painted work, but it wasn't specifically sexual. So
you had one more point that I think you wanted.
Yes, thank you. So could we have the next slide, please? So this is Sargent's late portrait of Henry James. After he did that early drawing, and he did another drawing which he didn't like. But he did this in 1915, I think, or maybe 13. And James was hilarious about the sittings. He loved going to, he described Sargent being so charming to be with in his beautiful, cool studio, opening upon a balcony, overhanging a charming Chelsea garden, adding a charm to everything. He liked always a friend or two to be in to break the spell of a settled gloom in my countenance by their prattle. So James loved this painting, and he said of it that he took it as if he seeming to look inward, as if taking his own advice to be one on whom nothing is lost. He declared it Sargent at his very best and poor old H.J. not at his worst. In short, a living, breathing likeness and a masterpiece of painting. He went on, I am really quite ashamed to admire it so much and so loudly, as if I were calling attention to my own fine points. I don't, alas, exhibit a point in it, but am all large and luscious rotundity. by which you may see how true a thing it is. So he had friends come to the studio to see it, and he stood beside it and said that the painting puts the original to shame.
Well, and he has such a incredible look on his face. You know,
Yes.
it's not the look of someone. It's a look of someone talking to a friend, or not looking at a stranger. It's so lifelike in that way.
Yeah. Sorry, did someone have a comment? Yes, talking to a friend, and in the presence of a friend. I mean, he's really very relaxed and thinking at the same time.
So, Jean, your book, which you've been reading from, is not primarily about Henry James. It's about another group of people who Sargent had a very close relationship with, but who I think are not as well known, even to people who love his work. The Wertheimer family. Mm-hmm. And so, who are this family? How did you get into to learning about them? And can you tell us about who they were and their relationship with Sargent?
Sure, thank you. Could we have the next slide, please? So the father of this family was a man named Asher Wertheimer, who was an art dealer in London, a very successful one. His father had come from Bavaria to London to be an art dealer in the 1830s, and he was rather quickly dealing to the Rothschilds, and not too long after that to the royal family. And both of his sons, Asher and Charles, also went into the art dealing business. In the late 1890s, Wertheimer, they were German Jews, the whole family. Wertheimer commissioned portraits of himself, his wife, and their 10 children from Sargent. And in the process, they became very good friends. I don't know how they met, but since Asher had a gallery on New Bond Street, it's quite likely that Sargent went there and saw some of what he had. He was mostly dealing in 18th century, what the markets wanted then, which was 18th century decorative arts, old master portraits, the standard taste of aristocratic Britain in those years. It took Sargent about 10 years, from 1898 to 1908, to complete this sequence of Wertheimer portraits, because he was doing quite a lot of other things at the same time. It was sort of the high peak point of his career. He was hugely in demand, and he mock complained to a friend of being in a state of chronic Wertheimerism. He actually raised his prices during this period because he wanted to discourage commissions. He was just drowning in them. So the responses to these paintings, especially the one of Asher, we'll show some more in a minute, but they were very mixed. They were sort of a Rorschach test for most of the century, the 20th century, and now as well. They received high praise and harsh criticism, much of it anti-Semitic. They look very Jewish, especially Asher. And Asher obviously didn't mind. I think that he thought this is what he looked like, and that Sargent had, people compared it to a Rembrandt. Rembrandt also painted a lot of Jews. But a Bostonian who was being painted at the same time that this was in Sargent's studio looked at Asher. He's got, let me describe it a little bit. This raking light from above falls on his balding forehead. His lips are sort of red and wet. He's got a cigar in his left hand, and his thumb on his right hand is hooked into his trouser pocket. And it's a little hard to see. It's right behind Madeleine, but his poodle, Noble, is at his knee with a red tongue lolling, hanging out. So you could see this as Asher's red lips and the dog's tongue as having to do with the trope of Jewish appetite, carnal appetite, which I don't think Asher did see or mind, but some of his friends were offended. And so this man it was Ian Phelps Stokes who came in and saw this and said that Asher looked as if he were pleasantly engaged in counting golden shekels. And Asher left the paintings to the National Gallery they would go after he and his wife had died. So that was in 1923. They went up right away as soon as the wife had died, and there were huge crowds flocking to see the paintings, and there was a debate about them in Parliament. And one of the members of Parliament said to the head of the committee, "Can't you manage it so that we don't have to have these repulsive pictures on our walls for all time next to the beautiful examples of the work of Turner?" So it went, there were, other people said, "Happy is the man who was painted thus." So it just went back and forth, and it has continued to do so for the last 100 years. And most of that time, the paintings have been in storage. They went from the National Gallery to the Tate, and they are not shown very often. So can we look at a few of the other, could we see some more? This is the two eldest Wertheimer daughters, Ina and Betty. Ina's the taller one and the eldest. Sargent was particularly close to her. When he was working on this in his studio, a friend of his came to visit the studio and said, "What do you think of the taller girl? Isn't Miss Wertheimer beautiful?" And then a minute later, "Isn't she handsome?" And then a few minutes later, he asked it yet again. So he was enthralled with her appearance. Let's see the next one. Yeah, she was indeed beautiful. She was 6 feet tall, full of energy and vitality, and just a force of nature. And he painted her twice. And I can't remember whether I have the other one in this, but she was quite something. And they became very, very close friends, as he did with Asher, who visited him. Asher came to visit Sargent in his studio every Sunday. How are we doing on time? Are we okay? Okay. So the next one, please. That's what Asher looked like in a photograph. So you can we go back for a minute, or is this? Let me see. Yeah, there it is. So you can sort of compare the photograph to the painting. They're not the same, but it's fairly accurate as to what he looked like. There is here is Sargent at the Wertheimers' country house on the Thames. The man on the left is not identified. Asher is the second one from the left. A painter named Henry Mancini, an Italian whom Sargent was trying to help out. He was kind of a mess, but Sargent was extremely kind to him. And then very tall Sargent, and Edward Wertheimer, who was the oldest son, who was going into the business with his father, but he died on his honeymoon in his 20s after eating a bad oyster and contracting typhoid. So, among other things, it shows you that they weren't keeping kosher. They were not very religious. Let's see. This was his friendship with Monet. He went to Giverny, and Sargent is painting Monet, painting a very famous canvas, which I can't remember the name of, but it's Haystack, something about the Haystack Mountain or something like that. And it's at the Tate now. And the next one, so it was not a foregone conclusion that Asher would accept the painting of himself. This is his wife, painted at the same time, 1897-98, and they didn't like it. Her descendants say that she thought it made her look too rich. And she's wearing lots of jewels and beautiful white lace. Sargent, there was a show called Sargent and Fashion a few years ago in Boston and in London, which made it very clear how much he curated what his subjects wore. They would come in with something, and he would say, "No, bring something else," or he would offer something for them to wear. So I don't know whether this was his idea or her idea, but she didn't like it. So they kept it, but she gave it to one of her daughters, and it's now at the New Orleans Museum of Fine Art. And the next one is, he did her again 6 years later, and this was after both of her elder sons had died in their 20s, as I said, and you certainly see that here. She's just grave, mourning, majestic, apart, but the Wertheimers liked this one much more, even though it's so sad, and that's the one they kept. So let's see, one or two more, and then, oh yeah. So this is the younger three children, and they're done in the schoolroom. You can't really see it now, but there's a big globe in the upper left-hand corner of this where they were getting lessons. I had no idea when I started this how alien Jews looked to Anglo-Saxons in the early and late middle of the and late 19th century, and how they were described as Oriental. That was just not something I'd ever read about or thought about. And this painting in particular it elicited those responses. I think I won't read it again, but the critics were just sort of scathing about this rich, exotic environment, as if they were describing the inside of a harem or something. And these are children, doing their schoolwork. So let's look at one more, and then we'll go ahead. Oh yeah, speaking of Orientalism, this was one of the younger Wertheimer daughters, and Sargent is playing around here. He always had costumes of his own, and this is a men's Turkish or Persian coat. It's somewhat based on an Ingres painting, Odalisque with Slav. That's there's a drawing of it anyway at Harvard. So she's exotically dressed in a turban with feathers and coins, and she's holding an instrument, an Indian sarod, she's holding it in completely the wrong position. She couldn't possibly play this. And there's a sliced melon, ripe melon at her feet, sort of making it all sexual. And so there was a trope of European aristocrats in the 18th century who had recently discovered the Ottoman Empire and had costume balls dressed in Oriental garb and were painted that way. So Sargent is referring to that at the same time as to his Oriental Jewess here. So play. Okay.
Well, I think we'll open it up to questions, but as you are all thinking about what pressing question you'll ask, I wondered to conclude, you've written now 3 books that touch on the late 19th century, and although you're not trained as a historian, they are all books of history, and I wonder what attracts you to this period, and how have you gone about doing your research, where you often uncover all sorts of wonderful details?
Thank you. I'll try to do this quickly. That's the fun part. What? We're okay. All right. Thank you. She says we're okay on time. I did not set out to become a historian. I majored in English, and I got into Alice James because of Henry James. But then when I was writing that book, I got very, very interested in the history dimension of it, because it was very much the history of women at that period, and Boston and Europe, and the Civil War, what happened after the Civil War. So the story sort of took me there. And then I've sort of done a period of writing a book and then taking a real job and then writing another book. So between Alice James and my Morgan book, I was a book critic at Newsweek for 4 years, and I was looking for a new subject toward the end of that period, and people kept coming to me with the wives and the daughters and the sisters of famous men, and I thought, I just wrote that book. I don't want to do the same thing again, because Alice's life she was the youngest of a family of 5 and the only girl, and her life was so dominated by being the sister of Henry and William James and the father of another sort of wacky philosopher, Henry James. And she was a nervous invalid who took to her bed with the vapors, which isn't something I particularly admire. I thought I wouldn't be able to stand it for 4 years. It turned out to be 5 years. So by the time I was finished with that book, I was really finished with it. And it's partly what took me into the history side as well, because just Alice by herself was hard to take. So because I'd liked the history part, I was looking for a figure from history, and I thought I wanted to do a man, and I thought I wanted to do a bad guy. I was sort of thinking Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kids. And at dinner one night, a friend said robber barons, and I thought, that's right in my period, the period that I know about, and they were certainly bad guys from what I knew. And so I flirted with several of them and finally settled on J.P. Morgan, because it turned out that the Morgan Library in New York had a basement full of uncatalogued papers that nobody except his son-in-law and one other biographer 40 years earlier had been through. So it's a very long story, and it took me a very long time to write. I did not know the difference between a stock and a bond, really. So I had a lot of work to do. And I really my preconceptions put blinkers on me for the first few years. I was looking for a bad guy, and I was prosecuting him. And a very good friend of mine and Martha Zuber's, Arthur Goldhammer, read the manuscript. I mean, it wasn't a full manuscript. It was just a draft of 100 pages or so of what I'd been working on, because I was really stuck and floundering. And he said, I quote a ton from my sources, especially in a first draft, because that's where I'm thinking it through. And he said, you're not listening to him. He's much more flexible than you're giving him credit for. He's interested in things that are surprising, and you're just prosecuting him all the way. So I had to let all that go and go back to the beginning and listen to him. And I changed my views completely. He's not a great American hero, but he was trying to be the Federal Reserve when we didn't have one. And he was not doing it to line his own pockets. He had grown up watching the Bank of England keep the British economy on track. No one was doing that here. This was a wildly growing, chaotic economy. He and his father were representing European investors who were putting money into the U.S. to build railroads, which were enormously expensive and didn't pay for a long time. So the money had to be patient. And when things got too wild and woolly and crazy, the European investors would pull their money out and the whole house of cards would fall down. So he was trying to discipline that. And that was much better, a much more admirable aim than what I had thought. I just thought he was rapaciously lining his own pockets. Plus, he was a fantastically interesting art collector, which I had not known. I knew that he was a collector, but I didn't know much about it. So all of that led me to a different view of him. And then Sargent figures in both of those stories. He was a close friend of Henry James. He painted Alice's friends. He had agreed to paint Morgan, who was really not a very attractive person. He had a bulbous, hideous nose. But then Sargent he gave up painting portraits in 1907, saying he'd just had enough of it. And that was around the time Morgan commissioned him to do his portrait, and he said he had agreed, but he said no. And when he gave up, he wrote to his cousin saying, "No more Paul-traits, Paugh-traits. I abhor and abjure them and hope never to do another, especially of the upper classes." So after that, he just traveled, which is what he always wanted to do, and painted whatever he wanted, landscapes, watercolors. Some of his friends, he did the Henry James portrait after that, also Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, but mostly he did charcoal portrait sketches, which were just fantastic. Here's one of his friend Sybil Sassoon. So we didn't really talk about his friendships with Jews. The Wertheimers were by no means the only ones, which I did not. I was surprised that he had his biggest commission came from a family of Jews, because you think of him as doing European aristocrats and Boston Brahmins, but he was very, very close to that family and to others as well, including the Sassoons. This is Sybil Sassoon. He also did her brother Philip and their mother, who had been born a Rothschild. And there were several others as well. I think he felt extremely comfortable with them, and they were among his closest friends.
So now we'll open it up to the audience.
If you have a question, please raise your hand high, and I'll bring you the microphone. Be brave. Coming.
I'd like to know about James. I'd like to know about James and Sargent. Were they in competition? It is that I have read that they were in competition, really, and that James came out much better than Sargent. That James was innovative in what he was doing, where Sargent was not. So I want to ask you, is that true or not?
It's a very complicated question. James was
Did everyone
indeed,
hear that question?
Yeah, she's asking. She said that she'd heard that James and Sargent were in competition, and that James came off better. That he was more innovative than Sargent. James certainly was innovative. He sort of was an early pioneer of the modernist novel. We could talk about that at great length, but probably not right now. But he did stream of consciousness in a way that nobody had really done before. The key scene in Portrait of a Lady is with Isabel Archer just sitting up all night thinking about what she has realized about her life and what she's done. There's not a dramatic scene of someone thinking for a whole chapter before that, and it changed a lot about the way the novel works. Sargent, I don't think they were personally and consciously competitive exactly, although there are elements. I'll come back in a minute. But Sargent, the rap against Sargent was that he was not innovating, that he was painting old-fashioned portraits as Picasso and Matisse were breaking art wide open. The Cubists were in the 1910s, around the time Sargent gave up doing portraits. There's a very good book, which I rather agree with, which is by a woman named Elizabeth Pretijon, called Interpreting Sargent, that talks about the modern sensibility, that what he's documenting is such a radical social change in both the old families and the new. You could, that big portrait of the two Wertheimer daughters, Ina and Betty, stepping out into the night. He did a number of portraits of British women that they're absolutely beautiful. I'm not criticizing them at all, but they're mostly seated in a middle distance and very composed. Ina and Betty are alive, they're sensual, they're vibrant, they're stepping out, they're almost up to the picture plane, and they're about to step out into the night and their lives and our lives. He loved visual drama, which he found in Morocco, in Africa, in Jerusalem, and in several Boston people and New York people, and also in Jews. So you could now say it was exoticizing and orientalizing. I don't really think of it that way, but I think he was doing some modern things, but certainly he was not changing art the way Picasso and Matisse were. And there's a wonderful quote from the critic Michael Kimmelman saying, this was in about 1999, saying that we all want to do something, anything, as brilliantly as Sargent handled a paintbrush. He was the gold standard in the Gilded Age, but he changed nothing, he invented nothing. So there's that.
Do you agree with that?
I don't completely agree with it. I certainly agree with the first part, and that I think he did change things. I think he looks different from the other portrait painters who were working at that time, but it wasn't as radical as modernism in literature or cubism in art.
Other questions?
Hi, thank you. So I saw the exhibit at the Musée d'Orsay. It's spectacular, and I'm from Boston, so Sargent's a rock star.
Right.
So I'm just wondering. So if you're saying maybe he was less impressively different or whatever, but I'm wondering why he was, virtually unknown in Europe. There's never been an exhibit until today of just him. Whereas, Henry James was huge on both sides of the Atlantic. So could you talk more about why Sargent sort of, unless it's simply because he wasn't as obviously original like Picasso, why he was so unknown in Europe when he was actually born here?
Well, and he was certainly known in France in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. You're just talking about now, sort of in the modern era. There's an interesting thing that's too long to go into right now, but Sargent was virtually canceled for most of the 20th century. all over, not just in Europe. In America, in London, he was not shown after his death in 1925. Partly that was because what he was most known for was painting fashionable aristocrats. And after World War I, and then World War II, and then the Depression, that's not what people wanted to see. And they not only didn't want to see it, they sort of disapproved of it. It was like he was doing high society when society was falling apart. And also, Roger Fry of the Bloomsbury Group was merciless in his attacks on Sargent. From very early on, he even said, almost puzzled, he said, I have been pelting him with disobliging remarks my whole life. And that had a huge effect in England and on critics in America. Some of the American critics were quoting Fry as late as the 1970s and 80s. I think Fry there was some legitimate criticism to be made, but I think it was so intense that it was really driven by envy. He wanted to be an artist. He wanted to make money. Sargent did both brilliantly. He made so much money that he could retire in his 40s, 50s, and just do what he wanted to do. And Fry could not stand it. I won't quote you, but it's vicious. So it began to change. There were a couple of exhibitions in America in the 1960s, but not of the fashionable, quote-unquote, portraits. It was of his friends, of landscapes, and then there was another one in the 70s in New York. Richard Ormond, who is his great-nephew and is the leading Sargent expert, he did the catalogue raisonné with a colleague named Elaine Kilmurray. It's a 9-volume catalogue raisonné. It's just fantastic. He began organizing some shows in England in the 1990s, which began to turn the tide a bit. And the art critic Hilton Kramer in New York wrote in the 1990s, "It's time to forgive Sargent for making it big in the 1880s." So it kind of, in America, there's a great Sargent exhibition every 4 or 5 years, and London has had much of the same. Paris has not, and I don't really know why. You might ask the curator, Caroline Corbeau-Parsons, who's organized this. But anyway, yes, it's a long answer to your question.
You mentioned that he retired in his 50s and then did what he wanted to do. Now, I thought that one of the things that he wanted to do was paint murals, because he has some at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts and also in the fabulous Boston Public Library.
Yes.
So did you want to talk about his murals?
I will briefly. I don't think it's his best work at all. He took a commission for the Boston Public Library in 1890. It was a McKim and White building, and he knew them. And at the time, a lot of people thought history painting was much more valuable and important than portrait painting. Even Joshua Reynolds, who started the Royal Academy and was the leading portrait painter of England in the 18th century, thought history painting was more important. And so I think Sargent was thinking Michelangelo, and I'm going to move into that tradition. He worked on it mostly in England, but he would come back and forth and do things in Boston for years. He worked on this for 30 years. And he also did murals in Widener Library at Harvard and, as you say, at, what was the other one?
The Boston Public Library.
Yeah, the MFA, sorry, thank you. So he obviously cared about this a lot. I don't think very many people care a lot about those paintings now, but they were what he was doing. He made a huge mistake in the Boston Public Library one. He chose to do, and this is maybe longer than we have time for, he chose to do, his subject was going to be the triumph of religion. He was not terribly religious. I don't know why he chose that, because, it was a big history theme, but not his private passion. And he used that model, the black former elevator operator for a lot of the figures, male and female. He was just a great model. He painted at the very last scene. There's an image of church and one of synagogue. The woman posing for church is this beautiful young woman holding. I can't remember. It looks like she's almost got the body of Christ across her lap. But she's seraphic. She's looking towards heaven. She's great. The woman being synagogue has fallen to the ground. She's an old crone. The tablets of the law are broken at her feet. It's just horrifying, shocking. And of course, not only Jews in Boston, but many people were shocked by this. And he didn't really have a defense. He said, that's what there is on Notre Dame, that's what I've seen on cathedrals all over Europe. Well, yeah, but that was 12th century Christianity. It wasn't really what we want in 20th century Boston. So it was a big shock. And I don't understand. I mean, it was just so stupid of him.
We have time for one more question. I'm coming around.
Thank you so much. There is a video of Madame X that is quite viral on social media with the youth, and I was wondering what you thought about why Sargent today is still enduring or relevant in these times, because it's a very, very popular video. The explanation of the strap and
I haven't seen that.
I'll send it to you.
Okay. This painting, this story, just captures people's imagination. Sometimes for Halloween, the Met has a costume party, and many people show up as Madame X. Down. And I think Sybil Sassoon is much more beautiful. I mean, Madame X is so cold, and that profile, that sort of pointy profile, but it's mysterious. It's not because of her beauty. It's, I think, because of the scandal, and because it's an incredibly striking image. When he had it in his studio, as we saw, and in about 1914 or so, he offered it to the Met, saying he would sell it to them, and corresponded with the chief of the Met, and he said in that letter, "I suppose it's the best thing I've done." I don't really think it is, but if he did, he knows more than I did, and certainly it's the feature of him at the Met and of this show. So, what do you have a sense of it, since you're a lot younger than I am?
Yeah, I'm not as young as the people watching this video, though. I feel like there is a side of it that the paintings come from a time where things feel like they would have been reposed, and it's almost like he's catching people, and I think social media is very interested in authenticity, and potentially because these paintings feel a little less posed, maybe that's what it is, and I think the sensuousness, the scandal of things that today don't feel scandalous, like the painting, I forget what it's called, it's around the same time as Madame X, but it's the man in the red robe.
Yes,
which was
Dr.
also
Pozzi.
seen as, like, was quite sexy,
Uh-huh.
what it was. I think that is probably also fun for people, because you're like, oh, that's what you were worried about. Wait till you see what's going on now. I'm not sure. I think maybe it feels very authentic.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know, I'm not an expert.
Yeah, I mean, she was certainly very posed, but if it doesn't look that way, more power to Sargent.
Can we have a really big round of applause for Jean and Madeleine?